think I'm freezing a little bit. I don't know why. Welcome to the second panel of our first day of Conference Architecture of Government. The second panel is on presidentialism, drawing mostly from the post-socialist countries, experiences from post-socialist countries. Initially, when we were planning the program of the conference, the idea is to bring together panelists who work on post-Soviet Russia, work on the East. To share their experience. Something final report of the State Capture Commission, what was suggested and recommended as one of the ways to prevent further state capture is the electoral reform, and actually that the South African people potentially choose their president directly. There is a very optimistic, not to say naive, sentence in that report saying that maybe if the South African people have had an opportunity in the past to choose their president directly, state capture wouldn't have happened. So I would actually like us to create Dr. Angela Stent. Advisor to the Center for Euro-Asian and Eastern European and Russian Studies at the Georgetown University. She's also affiliated to the Brookings Institution. She also served as a National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Euro-Asia and at the National Intelligence Council. Her work is primarily on the Russian foreign policy, but she also writes and publishes extensively on the relationship between Russia and the West, but also between Russia and the rest, to say it like that, which is for us especially relevant. Thank you, Angela, for joining us. Our second panelist is Professor Dušan Spasojević. Post-communist democratization processes. His work is mostly on Serbia, but also other former Yugoslav republics. Thank you, Dušan, for joining us. Dobrodošao. And our third panelist is Professor Anthony Butler, Professor of Political Studies at the University of Cape Town, that works mostly on the politics of public policy, but also in the last while, he contributes significantly to the better understanding of South African political life by deconstructing those inner workings of the African National Congress, to say it like that. Thank you, Anthony, for joining us. So I would propose to start, each panelist will have a 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. Russia has a super presidential system, and the Russian people certainly directly elect the president. But the problem is that since Mr. Putin has been in power, they haven't really had any choice in terms of which president they elect. And it certainly hasn't really had any impact on the issue of state capture. But I will certainly come back to that. And I'm glad that Jelena mentioned this as a sort of focal point, because one of the issues in Russia, and it's been the same for 1,000 years, this isn't a new problem, is the issue of succession. There is no regularized succession mechanism, never has been, either in the Tsarist imperial times, in the Soviet times, or now in the post-Soviet times. And the one peaceful transfer of power in the post-Soviet times was when President Yeltsin handed over power to the rather Russian and Soviet history, the only models of presidential succession have been either death by natural causes, death by unnatural causes, so czars were murdered from time to time, or a palace coup. And you certainly had that in the Soviet times, or revolution. And of course, you had revolution in 1917. And I would say you sort of had a revolution in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. So that's point one. Let me say something about political parties in this super presidential system. So under Putin, there have basically been 4 other political parties, apart from the ruling party, which is called United Russia, that have been allowed to sit in the parliament, the Duma. Before Putin came to power in the 1990s, Communist Party, and the Communist Party still has quite a few adherents, including younger ones. But all of these parties are essentially controlled by the Kremlin, and they receive money from them. So even though from time to time the communists will field candidates maybe in local elections that will win, and they criticize Putin's policies, they also, they know what the line is, and they can't swerve very far from that line. Now, at the local municipal election in Russia, and system, at least until the war broke out, I would say, you do have opposition politics. So the kind of competitive politics that doesn't exist on a national scale has existed at the local level. And in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, you have local council people, town council people who are super presidential system, what the president is doing, or you use the word war to describe what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, you can get up to 15 years in prison for doing that. So you have the super presidential system, you have 5 political parties, one of which is the ruling party, and yet it's still very important in this system to legitimize it, to have elections in which the United Russia Party does well, because it is seen that that is important to legitimize what the people in the Kremlin are doing. And so in the lead up to parliamentary elections in Russia, there's all this frenzy about, what percentage of the vote will United Russia get? And if it doesn't, what are we going to do about it? There's vote falsification. But it seems like a paradox, because this is a parliament talk about state capture, if you like. What is the essence of this system in Russia, the super presidential system? We can call it the Putin system, but it could outlast him too. And I'm going to quote a Russian colleague of mine who said, Russia is run by the people who own it. So you have a fusion in Russia and in a number of other post-Soviet states too, of money and power. And so you have President Putin, and you have a small group of people around him, all of whom are very wealthy. One can speculate, some people say that President Putin's the wealthiest man in the world. Who knows? But certainly he and the people who surround him, most of who come from the security services, are very wealthy. How did they accumulate that wealth? It's largely from the rents from oil and gas revenues. Russia remains from hydrocarbons. And we know from the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, the accounts that are held offshore, be it in Panama or the Cayman Islands, wherever, by people who are close to Putin and who have billions of dollars there, much of which come from the rents from oil and gas. And there are huge wealth discrepancies in Russia. That's the important thing. There's great inequality. And the other thing to remember is there are really two Russias. You have Moscow and St. Petersburg, particularly Moscow, that at least until now are world-class, globalized, cosmopolitan cities, restaurants with Michelin stars. You go there and you feel like you're in any other major city in a developed capitalist country, and people live well there. And the rest of the country, there's great poverty. There's still areas in Russia where people don't have water. I mean, literally, there's a huge contrast between the depressed areas and then these two cities. And I think that's also symbolic of the way that wealth has been distributed and the state captured that. And nepotism, that's another feature of this system. So if you look at some of the top people around Putin, their sons, and it's mainly the sons, occasionally the daughters, they're now heads of banks and they're already in the succession line. So there's a great deal of nepotism in the system. There always has been. This isn't new to the Putin regime, but there certainly is there. And then this is a neo-patrimonial system, if we're going to use political science terms. So you have Vladimir Putin on the top. He's the most powerful individual in this system, the president, but he's not all powerful. And so beneath him, there are different groups. The Russians call them political clans, who depend on him, again, for the patronage, and he depends on them for their support. And there's competition between those groups. And that's how the system functions. And again, this is how it functioned hundreds of years ago as well. This is a highly personalistic system. So that's the other feature of the Putin super presidential system. There are very few political institutions in contemporary Russia. There were actually more institutions in the Soviet period. You had the Communist Party, you had other institutions that to some extent acted as a brake on each other. I mean, Nikita Khrushchev, who was ousted in a palace coup in 1964, was overthrown by a group of people from the Communist Party, and there was a method to all of this. But today, it's very highly personalistic. The institutions really don't tell you anything about how it functions. And it is run by people from the security services in a way that no Russian government has ever really been run before. In the Soviet period, the Communist Party acted as a brake on the KGB, on the intelligence services. You don't have that anymore in this highly personalistic system. Now, this is a system, unlike the Soviet system, which lacks an ideology. That was a very important feature, clearly, in the Soviet system. There is no universalistic ideology anymore. The ideology that Mr. Putin speaks about and praises is supposed to appeal to the Russian world, the Ruski Mir, the Russian-speaking people who live, be it in Ukraine, be it, in New York, in Armenia, around the world. And the idea is that Russia is a unique Eurasian civilization, and that Russian-speaking people, believe in all of this. And Putin puts forward Russia as the true heir of a conservatively Christian bulwark against what he describes as the Satanistic Christianity and mores of the Western world. And so this is the essential part, that we're different from other countries because we're the true inheritors of Christianity, and the rest of the world, the West, is satanic. And if you want to, you can go on the web. You can look at the last meeting of the Valdai International Discussion Club, where Putin was criticizing wokeness in the West, particularly in the United States, but other things. Now, Russians, at least until the war began, was free to travel, unlike in the Soviet times. That's changing somewhat. 300,000 Russians have left since the war began. And so from the Kremlin's point of view, this is a safety valve, so that if you don't like the system, you can leave. You're not prevented from leaving. But otherwise, there has been increasing repression. So in the Russian super-presidential system, there's no freedom of speech. There's no freedom of assembly. There is, as I say, still some freedom of movement. And the new term to describe people who criticize what's happening is that they're foreign agents, that they're agents of the United States or other Western countries. And we're now back to the system which existed in the Soviet times, when you have even now children reporting on teachers who use the word war in a classroom, and then these teachers are disciplined, they're fired. So we're really going back to a much more repressive system. So what does the Constitution say? The basic Constitution of the Russian Federation was written in 1993 in the super-presidential system, and it's been amended by Putin in the year 2000. A number of reasons there. The primary one was to enable him to stay in power legally until 2036, by which time he will have been in power 10 years younger than Stalin was. So that would be 36 years. And his justification for that was, in the post-Soviet period, Russia, faced many challenges, and it's a young country, he said, and we need more time to stabilize it. And so, we can come back to it at the end, but nobody knows how long he'll stay in power. So this is in a super presidential system like this with few institutions. The leader can manipulate it and stay in power for a very long time. I'm also thinking about a country like Zimbabwe, where you also had a leader who stayed in power for a very long time. So this is what's happening in Russia now. The impact of this kind of system, or the way it's run, is that under Putin and the people around him, Russia has really not modernized in the way that people expected that it would after the Soviet collapse. And this is something, by the way, that the Chinese often express incredulity about. The people, as I say, have made a lot of money living off the rents from oil and gas revenues, and they have not modernized either their political system or their economy. And they were, until recently, however, obviously part of the global economic system, and as a result of the war and the sanctions, they're now becoming increasingly deglobalized. But one thing, one area where they've been very successful, and maybe we will come back to that in the discussion, is in terms of the foreign policy, in terms of the relationship with China, with the rest of the world, as Jelena was saying, and we see that clearly in the results, the reaction of much of the rest of the world to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm going to just say a few words to contrast the super-presidential Russian system with the Ukrainian political system. Now, in Ukraine, the Ukrainians in the last 30 years have gone back they vacillated between a stronger presidential system and a stronger parliamentary system. And in Ukraine, unlike Russia, the Rada, the parliament, is not a rubber stamp institution, and it pushes back often against the presidency. And if you want to watch something that's both amusing and very well done, about the Ukrainian political system, I recommend to you Servant of the People, which was a series, of course, which current President Zelensky starred in when he was a comedian. And it's precisely about a young president in Ukraine who tries to reform this corrupt system and all the obstacles that he encounters, both, again, from the corrupt oligarchs there, but also from the parliament. So, as I say, Ukraine has vacillated between the two, and now it has, again, a system where the president is stronger, but again, where the parliament can push back and does, and doesn't always vote for the legislation that the president and his people want. And there are a number of different political parties in the Ukrainian political system, and they're not supported by the president, and they're real political parties, and they have different views. They are, however, supported by wealthy oligarchs. So in this system, corruption is rife. There are, a number of extremely wealthy people who have been controlling the media, who they have competing sometimes media outlets, but they control different media outlets, and they do also control some of the people who are in the parliament. So that corruption is there, and this has always been a problem in the system in Ukraine. Ukraine is, however, a much more pluralistic society than Russia is, at least until the war began. Obviously, it's under martial law now, but, the freedom of expression, assembly, and things like that were certainly there. And I think the most important difference between Ukraine and Russia was in Ukraine, you could never actually predict the outcome of a presidential election because they really were competing candidates, and the elections certainly were competitive. There's no sort of managed transition there. But, the Ukrainians have also, I would say, forfeited much of what they could have done in the last 30 years because of the corruption of the system. And one statistic is interesting. If you look at where Ukraine and Poland were in 1991, their GDP per capita was roughly equal. Now, Poland's per capita GDP is 5 times that of Ukraine. So Ukraine remains a very poor country, again, because it hasn't taken the tough measures, anti-corruption measures, and reform measures. But there's maybe still some hope for the future, depending on how this war comes out. So I would say, to come back to Russia for a moment, this is a system which, on the one hand, you can say it served the Russian people for the first maybe 8 years of Vladimir Putin's rule, when oil prices were rising and when people's standard of living went up. They were certainly better off than they were in the 1990s. It's maybe served them by restoring a more effective state, because in the 1990s the system was very chaotic after the Soviet breakup. But it has not, and some Russians, of course, have become very wealthy and live very well. But I would say it hasn't served the majority of the people, there's very little recourse for the Russian people to have any input into what happens in their system, even though they do directly elect the president. So maybe I will stop there, and then we can come back to some other questions.
Yes, thank you, Angela, for your very detailed, very inspiring presentation. I think our audience listening from South Africa probably has so many questions, because even at this first listening, it's very easy to identify certain similarities between what you said exists in Russia today. For example, the great inequality, the widespread nepotism, neo-patrimonialism, they will find it very familiar. So maybe there's also then the risk, if South Africa moves to presidential system, that the outcome can be more or less similar. I will now hand it over to Dušan.
Thank you, Jelena, for the kind introduction, including Serbian words. But also thank you to Angela for creating a framework for thinking about the region. Probably the most simplifying way to answer to the questions we are asked is to say that Serbia is kind of, as we often say, a small Russia. And in a sense, there are many things that are common, but also there are significant differences, and I will try to explain them in my presentation. I will do the other way around. I will start from the institutional framework, and then try to speak about political consequences. And I will also try to answer the question about captured state, probably to point out some of the phases in the Serbian recent developments when financial system, which means that according to constitution, we have a rather strong prime minister and rather weak president. But president is directly elected. It has some kind of authority, which means that he, because we always had male presidents, fulfills this minimum criteria of semi-presidential system. And in a sense, it was the same thing in the same division of power, even in the first constitution drafted by Slobodan Milošević, who was the first president of Serbia. And that constitution was drafted during the Yugoslav time, when Serbia was part of Social Federative Republic of Yugoslavia, which also meant that president could not have as much authority as within the full independent or sovereign state. But the same division of power was kept even after the defeat of Milošević, because I would say it enabled new ruling coalition to divide the power among the key political parties, and they saw semi-presidentialism as an opportunity to divide the power. So everyone could have some share, which I think is a good solution for the transitional democracies, for democracies that are still looking for the identities and the solution, and they're establishing institution in a way. The same can be said for the electoral system, and this is important because throughout Eastern Europe, political parties are the key players, and in a sense they hold more power compared to political parties in Western or old consolidated democracies. In that sense, we always need to pay attention to division of power between the political parties. We have a very specific version of proportional representation system, which means that we have only one electoral district. There are only few or three examples. For example, the Netherlands or Israel have something similar, which means that we can have a parliament that is representing all the differences within the society, but also it can lead to centralization of the political parties and lead to centralization or the presidentialization of the political of the parties themselves, meaning that presidents of the parties have more power compared to for example, local or regional branches in the case of different electoral systems. But in a theoretical sense, both key elements, political and the electoral system, enable enough measures to divide the power and to have some kind of balance between key players. And I would like to point out to the first post-Milošević transitional decade, when Serbia was facing with number of issues, with number of divisions, and in that sense can remind you of Ukraine in last 20 years. So those were the key issue. Do we belong to the East or to the West? What is the question of territorial sovereignty in terms of status of Kosovo, the southern province of Serbia that declared independence 10 or 12 years ago now. What are the relations with the other regional countries, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, the main issues were related to identity, to international affairs, but also to the core of the Serbian society. And during that first period, the electoral system and the political system provided enough balances that president of one party was in charge of the government, where the president of the other party was the president of the state, which was some sort of cohabitation, as they would call it in France, which at the same time allowed people to vote for other options and parties to change their position on the scale left and right, up and down, which means that there were no negative elements which we have in, for example, first past the post system in the UK or in the United States, meaning that there were no parts of society that were completely excluded from power sharing mechanisms. But on the other side, it was also the lack of the clear path or clear idea which kind of society should we create. And this is very important in the first transitional years, because there is a small opportunity to establish, or short opportunity to be more precise in time sense, to establish strong democratic institutions, or at least to start to establish them. We often refer to, for example, Latin American transition, and use this Rawlsian idea of that institutions, if we make institutions without not knowing how many votes or how many MPs we will have, then the institutions will provide us with checks and balances, the veil of ignorance in connection to institutional design. However, if you, for example, take a look at our constitution that was drafted in 2006, it reflects division of power between two most important people at that time. Only 10 years ago, none of them is important in political life, not even 10, maybe 5 or 6 years. And this division, which was the most important at that time, has no political relevance in 2000, for example, 2020. But still, it was some kind of dynamics that produce enough checks and balances, enough mechanisms to make Serbia minimal democracies in the case where there is a competing and pluralistic party system. What went wrong in the last 10 or last 15 years? First, in the second mandate of President Tadić, so I'm speaking now as post 2008 until 2012, Serbia had centralization of power. The president of the state was also the president of the strongest party, which means that at one point there was centralization of the power, and he was able to control two most important positions. Now, if you add the centralization of the political parties and extreme discipline of the MPs, you end up in a very specific position where elements of the semi-presidential system are actually not in a place. They're not working anymore. And it leads toward something that Angel described as an almost strong presidential system. However, there was enough strength within society, both within the leading parties, but also within the opposition, to create shift of power. And Serbian Progressive Party, which is the currently leading party, came to power. But then it led to more effective and more horrible and less democratic system, because they created even more centralization of power. They were the new party behind the very popular president Aleksandar Vučić, who is still now in the power, and they led to complete change of the political system without almost any single change of the formal rules. So this is now very interesting, because it's different, for example, compared to Hungarian or Polish situation, where you have a ruling parties which are shifting or changing the constitutions and formally changing the rules in order to fit their idea of democracy. So when President of Hungary, Viktor Orban, say that they will create illiberal democracy, they're changing the rules, changing the constitution, the laws, whatever they need to change in order to create Hungary as they want. However, in the Serbian case, we have a strong president leading a predominant party. However, they're ruling the state in informal mechanisms. They are concentrating the power in informal mechanisms, and they are generating something which is completely different compared to constitution and laws. If we want to go from time to time to political theorists, for example, Levitsky and Way describe this as a new competitive authoritarianism. So they say that current competitive authoritarian regimes are completely different or significantly different to ones we knew between 1990s and, for example, 2010, because the mechanisms they are using are much softer. They are adapted to something that looks like market economy or something that looks like to European framework, for example, in terms of countries that are in a process of accession to European Union. But at the same time, there is actually no free and fair elections. There is no choice for the people, and they use different mechanisms to reduce democracy to its minimum levels. And as you might be aware or not, in most international classifications, Serbia is not classified as a minimal democracy anymore. It's either hybrid regime or flawed democracy or competitive authoritarianism. So in that sense, we have the same rules that enable different division of power on a different level. However, in terms of very strong and very popular leader, which is able to generate significant support, we can end up in something that effectively is a strong presidential system with extremely strong features in terms of capture state, because they are using basically state funds and state resources to generate more power and to concentrate power and to exclude or minimize the damage they are facing from, for example, oversight institution or judiciary obstacles that are there but weak and so on and so forth. So in that sense, Serbian case basically shows you what can happen if you have weak institutions and if you don't have a strong enough civil society that is going to be vocal enough in a case where a president, in this case, is going above and beyond his authority. Of course, the rules of the game are bended in such a way that no civil society nor the opposition have enough capacity to challenge them. So in terms of electoral agenda or electoral promises, now we have almost 10 years of governance of the same party, we end up with no progress in terms of European Union integration, which was part of the electoral agenda. We are in the same position in regard to Kosovo as 10 or 12 years ago. There were no institutional reform. There is no strong anti-corruption agenda as it was once they rose into power. And basically there is practically 10 years without any specific policy or specific change within society, just more and more power and more concentration of power for the ruling party and for the president. And in that sense, I would argue, and I will stop here, that there are no rules. There are no possible institutional design that could prevent this kind of developments if civil society is not there, if media is not free enough to articulate other votes, and if, of course, checks and balances are not in place. We could see that probably in the second mandate of Donald Trump, but we didn't get the chance. I would say lucky. But in a Serbian case, it is clear that if someone is going to bend the rules to that extent, probably there is nothing. There are no rules that could prevent him of doing that. Okay. Thank you for now.
Thank you, Dušan. You, along with Angela, actually helped to paint that very grim picture of the road that South Africa shouldn't take, definitely. So, but after listening to you and also to Angela, one question comes into mind. Was there something about the nature of the post-socialist transition that created or helped or contributed to this kind of outcomes? And that have been avoided. So I would maybe like us to discuss a little bit more in the discussion part. And now I'm handing over to Anthony, who probably has the most difficult task here to, after listening to do previous speakers, bring those insights together and try to set us some recommendations for future when it comes to South Africa electoral reform.
Well, thank you, Jelena, for that optimistic summary of what I'm going to do. There was so much in those two presentations. What I thought I would try to do is to provide some local context, try to tie those presentations into our current political system in South Africa. And there are three ways that I should do that. The first of all, I wanted to come back to Jelena's introduction to explain why there is so much interest in presidential systems in South Africa at the moment. So South Africa has an essentially parliamentary executive. Citizens don't vote for the president. The president's elected by the National Assembly and is vulnerable to a vote of no confidence from the legislature. So in a way, a South African president resembles more closely a prime minister or a premier in a parliamentary system than a president. But without the presence of a figurehead president or monarch as head of state, the South African president also performs that role. Now, this issue is so salient because a presidential commission of inquiry, rather ironically, into state capture, as we've defined it here, has concluded after 4 years of evidence gathering that one of the changes that needs to be made to South African institutional architecture is direct election of the president. So the judge who has been chairing the Commission of Inquiry, who's now become our Chief Justice, he explained the voters do not elect the president. With regard to a president, he or she first gets put on the list of a political party, takes an oath as a member of parliament, and only then can the National Assembly elect the president. We are bound to ask the question, Justice Sondo continued, how did this country end up having a president, as president, someone who would act in the way President Jacob Zuma acted? A president who would, Sondo continues, fire his finance minister just because, I quote, friends wanted someone else in the position to help them capture the country, a president who became party to a scheme to remove executives from their positions at Eskom our power utility, which has made a major difference to our proceedings today, I think, for all of us here, so that the Gupta family could put their own associates in positions to facilitate the looting of the power company. So Zondo's argument is one that has a great deal of resonance among people here, that the power of the president has allowed him to undermine fundamental institutions in the country. But somewhat ironically, Zondo also believes that this is an argument in favor of direct election of the president by the people. So Zondo's claim is that if we have a president, the president must be exposed directly to an election by the citizens of the country. And in the theme of this conference, as I understand it, we're looking at institutions that have been chosen in the past, often for good reason, but ones that might nevertheless be changed beneficially to make the system of government as a whole more functional. So, I mean, my initial reaction to Zondo was surprise, but in South Africa we have judges and legal commentators who are often willing to express themselves on questions of institutional and political reform without any reference or attempt to consult the relevant academic literature on those topics. And I just wanted to say something briefly about what does seem to be there in the comparative politics literature. And one of the obvious reflections on the suggestion that we should have presidential elections is that you can't change an electoral system without changing the organization of the executive and its relationships to other branches of government. So direct presidential elections, if they're to be meaningful, require an undoing of the current fusion in our parliamentary system between the executive and the legislature. And that fusion is currently brought about through the medium of the governing party, the ANC, but in a parliamentary system, a governing coalition performs the same job. So the president is elected by the National Assembly, in which the governing coalition or currently party has a majority and can be removed through a majority vote. Cabinet ministers have to be almost entirely members of the National Assembly under our constitution. So those arrangements are not compatible with direct election by the people. If you have a popularly elected president, and that's a meaningful institutional change, they need to be able to appoint a cabinet that isn't just drawn from the current party system, and they cannot presumably simply be recalled, as the term is here, by a majority vote of parliamentarians, if there is any purpose to the direct election of those presidents. Now, in the political science literature, there has been some inconclusive debate since around the middle of the 18th century about the advantages of separation of powers and separate election of leaders of different branches of government. And in some respects, there hasn't been very much progress in that debate, in that there is still positions about the relative merits of presidential and parliamentary systems that follow debates that have occurred over the previous 2 centuries. And one of the first problems is that it's very difficult to define clearly in an uncontested way what the difference is between different systems of government. And very broadly, a parliamentary system is one in which the executive is chosen by and responsible to the legislature. So there is a single centre of legitimate authority within the political system, at least at national level. A presidential system is one in which there's a deliberate division of policy-making power between two separately elected bodies, the legislature and the presidency, the executive. And one key to that is the direct popular election of the president, mechanisms to prevent their removal except under very exceptional circumstances. So within the broad spectrum between parliamentary and presidential systems, you can get greater or lesser degree of separateness between president and parliament, and differences in the relative power of the two players. And Dušan provided a very interesting, I thought, description of the Serbian system, semi-presidential system, in which the prime minister is relatively strong and the president relatively weak, despite election. So we need to, when thinking about the degree of presidentialism or parliamentary character of a system, to consider the relative power of the different players. So what can we say on the basis of the literature about the relative merits of presidential versus parliamentary executives and the different forms of semi-presidentialism in between? And I think it's fair to say that the broad position in recent years has moved in favour of parliamentary executives of the kind that South Africa already possesses, and away from the presidential system that Zondo favours. So just to take the example of one influential empirical analysis from John Gehring, Gehring argues that in most cases, parliamentary government is associated with good governance, or with better governance. Those results are quite striking in terms of economic and human development, where there is a positive relationship between parliamentary systems and good governance, at least in almost every one of the cases that Gehring detailed. This includes an association between parliamentary government and measures of bureaucratic quality, investment ratings, per capita income, infant mortality rates, life expectancy. So the positive relationship is between parliamentary systems and both economic development measures and human development measures. And the longer that a parliamentary system is in place, the stronger those relationships become. Okay. Now, this is all fine. However, one concern is, as you know, political scientists don't have very many theories. The ones that they do have are not very good on the whole. And in this case, we have findings, but we don't really know why it's the case that there is this broadly positive relationship between parliamentary executives and desirable outcomes. So we don't have a coherent theory to explain it, but there are some mechanisms that have been advanced in the literature. One of those is that an elected executive, independently elected executive, so in a presidential system, that has strong policy making prerogatives. That makes the focus of political activity move away from the party system and from the legislature. So parties are weakened by presidential systems. Members of the same party are less likely to vote together in the legislature. The electorate is less likely to have ties, long-term ties and allegiances to particular political parties. And there are clearly advantages and disadvantages to that. And here I'm very interested in the cases that have been discussed. One fear must be that a significantly weakened party system, as we see in, for example, in more pure presidential systems in Latin America, can significantly weaken the party system. And one key question that I would ask of both of the speakers, if we have time, is the degree to which we should be concerned about a party system that in some way survives between particular occupants of senior offices in government. There's also an argument that presidential systems fragment interest group organization. So in our context, we have very divided interests, both in capital, so business is divided between established, formerly white businesses and black businesses, between a large established business sector and small entrants attempting to make progress in the economy, and also in labor, where there's been a highly fragmented and problematic labor environment. And all of these interest groups shot through with racial politics. That's one of the legacies of the apartheid system. Now, a presidential system seems to encourage the fragmentation of interest groups, whereas parliamentary government seems to make it more plausible to have some form of quasi-corporatism, as we attempt to have in South Africa. And one part of this is a second general issue that I'd like to ask both Angela and Dušan is about money politics. That money politics in South Africa has been very present and is clearly a part of what the Zondo Commission of Inquiry was probing. But it strikes me that money politics could become more of a problem in a system with weakened party discipline. So in a presidential system, it seems to me that the capture of senior leaders in government may be facilitated rather than hampered by direct election. There are other potential reasons why presidential systems produce or appear to produce worst outcomes. One of those is the complication of lines of bureaucratic accountability that they bring about. So once the executive and the legislature are separated from one another and operate in some respects at odds with one another, cooperation among agencies, lines of responsibility between executive and legislature become more complex. Now, none of these arguments, or even the weight of evidence in favor of parliamentary systems, is decisive. There can always be special considerations that make the system change desirable in South Africa today. And I'm particularly interested in the experiences of the post-Soviet world, because we have a lot of it. We have a lot of institutional experimentation, and we have a series of experiences that may suggest that semi-presidential, presidential systems bring benign consequences that haven't been anticipated. In addition to the perhaps the popular attractions of having direct presidential elections. And I think there are a lot of local considerations that militate against this, that we seem to have a political system in which we have the fertile ground for the rise of populist candidates. And populist candidates are to some extent contained by our complex political system and the need to build alliances within a dominant party, the ANC, or to come shortly, I suspect, a coalition that's able to secure a majority of seats in the National Assembly. So we have the danger of populists with personal mandates, and of course parliamentary systems cannot guarantee that we don't get the return of populist leaders. But the South African parliamentary system has, I think, contained the power of individual leaders. It certainly made it much more difficult for presidents to campaign on the grounds of racial, ethnic, or xenophobic appeals to the people. And it's avoided something that perhaps South Africa's original constitutional engineers in the transition were preoccupied with, which is the potential building of permanent dominant coalitions in pursuit of presidential power, dominant coalitions that might be based upon regional or ethnic coalitions. And it's important to remember that we haven't had a problem of South African presidents, heads of government, heads of state, lacking a personal mandate to lead, lacking necessary power to effect change. Indeed, with Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma, I think it's fair to say that their factions accumulated power in a rather alarming way, particularly in their second terms, and that those factions were reluctant to relinquish power when the presidential figureheads' second terms drew to a close. It was actually the party, the ANC, that dispatched those two lingering leaders and their factions with the implicit threat of a motion of no confidence, that was what brought about their resignations, and that's the strength rather than the curse of a parliamentary system. So to summarize, there are no obvious grounds to move from a parliamentary executive to an executive organized around a directly elected president, at least ones that are present in the broader comparative literature. And that judgment is perhaps bolstered by consideration of the costs of changing the system of government. And I wanted to also ask about that in systems that were established relatively recently, like South Africa's. What are the likely costs of trying to bring about system change? Let me leave it there, Jelena.
Thank you, Anthony, for this very rich overview of theoretical debates when it comes to different models of a political system. What I would like to ask you before we move to a discussion part, how all these different scenarios will further envelop if one would have to take into consideration the current nature of the African National Congress, its instability and maybe that risk of imploding eventually. So how any further electoral reforms could have been implemented having that in mind?
Are you asking me that question, Jelena? I mean, my view is that we have a system of government that makes quite possible change in the direction of political leadership in the country within existing institutions. And the complaint of many, including Zondo, appears to be that the citizens are failing to elect the right parties, the parties that will bring about that change. And I know we can joke about that, about how you resolve that problem, but that is the mechanism of change that we have in our system of government. And I think the dynamics of the presidency and the relationships between the legislature and the executive will change significantly as we have coalition government at different levels. And the mechanisms that are available for managing coalition government are very weak. So we have a period of transition, perhaps, a period perhaps in which the electoral system itself will come under enormous pressure. But none of those problems, I mean, this is something I took from Angela and Dušan, really, is that none of these kinds of problems are resolved by institutional fixes. And the fundamental problems of the society, including massive exclusion of people from economic opportunities, the role of money, the fusion between money and power, the organization of much of the political system around the centralization and distribution of rents, that these are problems that can't be resolved by the institutional fix of presidential elections. And of course, it's rather, of course, Angela and Dušan won't realize how much they have cheered up South African viewers by presenting the problems of very different political systems in different places. But that's my view, that it isn't the institutions that are obstructing those changes.
Thank you, Anthony. I will open the discussion section now, and before we move to the questions from the viewers, I would invite Dušan and Angela to respond to the presentation of other panelists. Angela, would you like to start?
Well, I mean, I found both of those presentations very instructive and interesting. I mean, obviously, the Serbian political system, has some features in common with what's happening in Russia, but it is different. As we heard, it's a semi-presidential system. There is still, much more opportunity in that system for people to argue with each other, and there is more of a civil society, at least that it's allowed to express itself. And clearly in the discussion about South Africa, there are so many different dimensions, obviously, that Anthony raised, and though the issues of state capture are clearly, this is a theme running through everything that we've been talking about. But again, I think the traditions, at least from the South African system, what that emerged from the apartheid era, it's just so different from the traditions that that Russia emerged from. I mean, the word transition was used in this discussion, and I think we have to remember that. And I'm talking now about Russia and the post-Soviet states, and probably also the countries in the Balkans as well. This idea that after the communist system collapsed, and the communist system itself, was also corrupt. Clearly, bribery and corruption were a feature of it. It's just that the scale, certainly in the case of Russia, was not the same as it is today. When Russia, became part of the global economic system. But the idea that there was going to be a transition, from an authoritarian to a more democratic, pluralistic state, from a state-controlled economy to a market society, and in Russia's case, from an imperial to a post-imperial power, I think you can safely say that this was probably conceptually quite wrong. And that certainly in Russia's case, if you look at the transitions, Russia hasn't made a transition away from an authoritarian to a more democratic polity. It has made a transition away from a state-controlled economy to not to a free market economy, but to where there's a capitalist element to it. But in the Russian case, the state has taken over, much, all of the major industries are very closely linked to the state. So it's certainly not free market capitalism. It is a sort of a capitalist system. And as we can see in the Russian case, Russia never made the transition away from an imperial to a post-imperial state. So I think it leaves us conceptually sort of scratching our heads because this was the orthodoxy early on. And I think few people sort of really accept the concept of, transition to what? You're moving away from one system, but there are many elements of the previous system that are still very present, certainly in the current system in Russia, and I would assume also in Serbia. So in answer to one of the questions here, which I guess you raised, Jelena, about what is it about the previous systems that, continue to influence the current systems? I mean, I think on the one hand, you have to realize in the post-Soviet context, it's just 30 years, which is a very small amount of time compared to the hundreds of years that produce this system, and I think the nature of corruption, and then I think the nature of the relationship between the leadership and the people, again, is very much has been very much influenced by what was there before. We talked about civil society. Of course, there's civil society in Russia, but it's been very repressed. There was more civil society earlier on when people were able to express their views. And as civil society is allowed to function in certain areas, things that have to do with local issues, with the environment, ecology and things like that, you have very, very active groups. But at least in Russia, the civil society has practically zero influence on sort of high politics. So I guess those are just some of my reactions to what was said.
Thank you, Angela. Dušan?
I might quote some of our students, when I start, for example, teaching them about transition, and some of them would raise a hand and ask, excuse me, how long this transition is supposed to last? We started it like in 2000 or 91, is there any end to it? So in a sense, it's more of a process that lasts, and then of course it depends what you compare it. If it's like one person lifetime, then we are very unhappy, and we cannot share our happiness with the South African people. But if you look at it in a sense of development of a certain society, then of course that it takes a lot of time. But at the end of the day, it depends. I would say that you need to evaluate if there is a certain direction or not. If we are going back and forth, or if we are going regardlessly how slow in a certain direction. And in case of Serbia, we see more of back and forth than some kind of, well, I wouldn't say progress, because it depends. Something is better than something else. Anthony raised many important issues, but he also made a point, or at least I hear it in this way, that we don't have a clear plans or clear advices, clear recipes how to do something. Even with a huge experience of comparative politics in the last, let's say, 100 years, there is, I mean, every country is a unique case, and the formula is so complicated that even if you gather the smartest scientists that develop a plan, then there are so many elements that you have to take into account when thinking what might be the outcome. So in that sense, changing of institutions are just nudges or incentives in certain direction, without a clear idea what is going to be the outcome. Something similar to the measures we have during the last 2 COVID years. There are some ideas, but we don't know what are the outcomes, and the process is changing all the time. In that sense, probably the most interesting questions that have been raised here are the links between the political system, or the presidential system, and the political parties. And the Serbian case shows that there is a strong decline of the presidential parties once the president or the candidate is defeated. We had a Milosevic party, then Boris Tadic party, and I think we could expect the same thing about Serbian Progressive Party in the future. But this is not only the cause of the presidentialization of the certain party, but it's also the consequences of the concentration of the power. Namely, one party becomes superpower, and in a sense, after it's either outside of the office, or it has to share to become part of the coalition, then their support is going back to previous stage or something in between. A case of Montenegro is going to be very interesting, to add another small post-Yugoslav state, because they have the same leader, President Đukanović, who is there since the 1991. So we are expecting to see him out of the office for the first time next year. So it's going to be very interesting to see what's going on with his party, which is a ruling party in Montenegro for the last 30 years. That is the only party that has not been out of the office since until the last August. So there are more and more interesting cases here. In terms of populist challenge, that is kind of interesting, because we always perceive that populist leaders are able to win the popular vote and direct elections. In contrast to cases like France, where you have a second round of elections, so the voters can organize themselves and vote against Le Pen or whoever they dislike most. Serbian case is also interesting in this regard, because the leading party does not have a clear ideology. Again, if you compare Serbia to Hungary or Poland, where the Fidesz or PiS have very strong ideological profile, Serbian Progressive Party is a really catch-all party on steroids. So they have pro-Russian elements, they have pro-European elements, they have LGBT. We have Serbian prime minister is a lesbian, but also they have the Belgrade mayor is anti-LGBT Congress, Euro Pride in Belgrade this September. So they're really all over the place in that sense, and they have this different kind of populism. So again, we need always to look into the details and context is, which makes this, of course, debate very complex, which can also be seen by the comment section on the YouTube, because they ended up commenting a war in Ukraine. So maybe I should stop speaking and let people ask some more questions.
Thank you, Dušan. You actually finished it nicely, because the war in Ukraine is the topic that our audience is most interested in, especially having in mind the expertise of Angela. Yes, so if I could summarize all the questions that we received, I could summarize them in two. One is, to which extent you think the Russian anxiety and aggression was triggered by the NATO expansion? And the second one is, how do you think the implications, what would be the implications of the war to the world outside of the West? And do you see some kind of new non-aligned movement emerging after the war is ended? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those questions. Okay. So my view of this is that the people who blame NATO expansion for this war are quite wrong. Putin, ever since he came to power, and even before that, when he was serving as a KGB official in East Germany, for him, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and for many other Russians, was, as he said, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, because so many Russians, 25 million of them, were found living outside of the Russian Federation. And so he has been quite explicit from quite early on that he saw as his mission was to reverse the consequences of the Soviet collapse, to relitigate the end of the Cold War and the settlement that was reached when the Cold War ended, when the Soviet Union collapsed and all of the former Soviet countries were recognized as independent countries. And he now says, and again, not only he, but a number of people around him, they question the legitimacy of the Soviet collapse, and they don't, they want to reverse it. So that's always been there. So in the 1990s, the West, the United States, and its European allies were faced with a choice. You had countries in Central and Eastern Europe who had been dominated by Russia, invaded by Russia over the centuries, and who wanted to ensure that now that the Soviet Union no longer existed and the Warsaw Pact was gone, that they could in fact be independent countries and choose their political orientation. On the other hand, you had a Russian leadership, even under President Yeltsin, who believed that Russia had special rights in the post-Soviet space. And so, I ask all the listeners, if you look in the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the French and the British empires all collapsed. And with difficulty sometimes, the imperial powers in the end accepted the loss of empire. You had the French-Algerian War, obviously, which was one of the last gasps of it. But in the Russian case, you've had a group of people who believe that Russia is different. It's exceptional, and you don't have to accept the loss of the end of empire. And so the choice was made in the 1990s to expand the NATO alliance because these countries wanted to join, and also because there was a lot of irredentism still. If you think about the history, the Romanian-Hungarian territorial claims against each other, there was a concern that these countries in Central Europe that hadn't known democracy either ever or only very briefly in the interwar period, that they would then start fighting each other, and joining NATO forced them to give up these territorial claims and things like that. But it meant that the West couldn't satisfy both the desires, the security concerns of the East Europeans and those of Russia. And so you did end up with a system in the 1990s, a Euro-Atlantic organization in which Russia really didn't have a stake. But you did have also the formation of the NATO-Russia Council in 1997. So this is by way of saying, from Putin's point of view, the threat of Ukraine joining NATO, right? Putin has even said in the last 2 weeks, it's fine if Sweden and Finland want to join NATO because Russia doesn't have any claims on them. But the threat of NATO was that had Ukraine joined NATO, it would have been impossible or very difficult for Russia to take back these lands. And you can also make the argument that if Ukraine had joined NATO, then you wouldn't have this war because Russia wouldn't have been able to attack it. So, Putin's goal, it's an imperial one. It's to recreate a Slavic union, at least, of Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and probably northern Kazakhstan. But Putin has also said, maybe his sights will go, the bringing back of these territories goes further. He's likened himself to Peter the Great, the 18th century Tsar who defeated Sweden in a war and then took the Baltic states. So all of this is by saying that the threat from NATO is not because Russia fears that NATO is somehow going to attack Russia, but because it made it much more difficult for Russia to take back these territories. And therefore, you still have a Russia, at least under the current system, that believes that it has a right to take back these territories and not to have an independent state there. Now, on the second question, we will be in a very different world. Obviously, the countries of the global south, all the BRICS countries, including South Africa, China, and Brazil, India, these countries, and then a number of countries on the African continent, in the Middle East, and in Latin America, including Mexico, have the United States as neighbor and very important trading partner. All of these countries have not condemned what Russia has done and have not applied sanctions. And I don't think any of them will. They all have their own reasons for doing it. Obviously, in the South African case, it has a lot to do with history, with the support that the Soviet Union gave to the ANC in the struggle against apartheid, their economic reasons for this, and a number of countries, probably including South Africa, their attitudes are also shaped by the way that they view what the United States has done in other conflicts, where it has also, in their view, not had United Nations sanction for what it's done in terms of some of its actions. I'm thinking particularly for what happened in the former Yugoslavia, but other cases. So, and in the Indian case, obviously, it sees Russia as a very important bulwark against China. I was at the Valdai International Club Conference in 2019 in Sochi, which was a week before the first Africa-Russia summit, the first one in the post-Soviet era, and it was very clear to me from talking to the African delegates who were there, that they had a favorable view of what Russia was doing, and they too saw Russia to some extent as an alternative to China, which has been extremely active on the African continent. So for all those reasons, you have a significant block of countries in terms of population, actually more than the population of the West, United States, Europe, Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Canada, and those countries are not taking sides. So I think what that means going forward is you will have a situation in which presumably the collective West will redouble its efforts to contain what Russia is doing and Russia's ability to disrupt the Euro-Atlantic security system, if you like. And then you will have the rest of the world that will be non-aligned, that will not take sides in this. And unlike in the Cold War, when a large number of countries in the developing world were forced to take sides. I mean, you did have a non-aligned movement then too, but large numbers were. That isn't going to happen anymore. Nobody's going to try and force countries to take sides in this, and therefore you will have. It'll be probably a more disruptive world in the sense that you will have a group of countries not taking sides and wanting to deal with all sides, and then you will have, if you like, the collective West trying to at least put pressure on Russia and, of course, on China too. So I think the countries of the global South will probably have more of a say on certain issues than they've had before, because you will have this new alignment.
Thank you, Angela. To thank also Anthony and Dušan for joining this discussion, the very fruitful discussion I certainly enjoyed, and I think that some of the great insights can come out of this. Thank you once again.